Hi, Misha here, and these days, it seems like there's really nothing new under the sun. Try to do videos sometimes on newer products, sometimes on historically cool, rare, obscure products, and sometimes just on something I felt like talking about and shooting my own self. And that's today's video. We're going to talk about one of the most talked about guns around, the Colt M4 Carbine. Although, the truth is, back in the day, say before 2009, 2010, it wasn't that easy to find a mil-spec one. At least mil-spec except for the go-fast switch. Yeah, a lot of the commercial manufacturers cut certain corners, did certain things differently. For example, the furniture, the barrel. And then in the modern times, it's kind of hard to find one. You can find the M4 types every frickin' where, but it doesn't take it to the other extent. It's not kind of blowing past current Army and Air Force and Navy and Marine issue M4 and M4A1s. It's always been kind of struggle to find a good one. And while I grew up with the SP1, therefore, M16A1 style gun, that was oftentimes my father's generation. For my generation, when I was coming of age, the M4 was the newest gun out there. Even before the War on Terror, as it's known, kind of kicked off, it was the talk of the town. Some might dismiss it as just a, just an AR. Very true. Some might say it's a wholly new gun, especially if you're Colt trying to, make money and do patents. Yeah, fair. But its history is quite colorful, and that often gets kind of obscured. That is going to keep rotating. That is going to keeps getting obscured because of just how prolific it is today. With basically 500,000, give or take, in U.S. military service, Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard even, Space Force presumably, and police and all that. It is kind of de rigueur. It is kind of somewhat boring, but not to me, at least not some. So I thought I'd just kind of share my thoughts, my history with it, shoot at some because I felt like it. And as I've been trying to do from time to time, there'll be an extended version on Patreon with more personal anecdotes, outtakes, bloopers, jokes, what have you, just goofing off over on there. On YouTube, believe it or not, I do try to edit them down to be as short as possible. With that, before we go back to the Cold War era, as always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe, and again, there's that old Patreon. Check that out if you're interested. With Phoenix. As early as 1964, the U.S. Army and Special Forces, the Navy SEALs, Frogmen, wanted something more compact. But nothing was ever adopted. Yeah, there were a lot of off-the-shelf purchases, small order purchases, the 607, the 609, 610, the XM177s, and then later the XM177 E2s with the 629 and 630. But none of those were officially adopted, went through full trials. They went through testing, of course, but they were just Colt models that the military bought in the hundreds or maybe in some cases small thousands. Yeah, there was never really a carbine. Now, the Air Force, of course, had their GAU-5, later GUU-5Ps and all that. And you would have a few 1970s, 80s era so-called M16A1 carbines, typically with a 14.5-inch barrel at this point, like the 653. These would all still be 112 twist. So I have. Where our story really begins is with the adoption of the M16A1E1 experimental model as the M16A2 in September of 1982. At the same time, many in the military said, it would be good to have a carbine version again, but its priority wasn't super high. And this really did start off as simply a carbined M16A2, 3-round burst mode, the recently adopted 1-in-7 twist to fire the M855 cartridge, fixed carry handle A2. It had the 2-position receiver extension, full out, full in, from the XM177 series, although they would go from the original metal stock to the Fiberlight, although it was the Car 15 style. And the barrel is quite interesting. The Army Research Center did some testing in 1983, and they concluded, much as Colt had already done, that a 14.5-inch barrel was kind of ideal. You know, the XM177, the original, with the 10-inch barrel, is very compact, too short. They extended it out to 11.5-inch, better, but you still had that 4.3-inch moderator, meaning when it was all said and done, you still had basically a 15-inch gun, including your device. This here is not even an inch longer, and you get a 14.5-inch barrel. Many benefits to that. You can mount a bayonet. You can fire grenades. You get quite a bit more velocity, dwell time. So going to the 14.5-inch was the next logical step. The Army agreed, Colt agreed. And at this time, this is a joint project in a way. It is a Colt project, but upon request and with some funding and assistance and testing done by the U.S. Army in 1983. Should also point out that the 9th Infantry Division requested a carbine, and that kind of led to a QRP that was formalized in January of 1984, and by February of 1984, we have this guy. And the name would go from kind of just being the Carbine M16A2, whatever, to XM4. And you would also get the U.S. Marine Corps involved. In fact, they were a big driving force for the M16A2, as I'm sure you know. So it was an Army and USMC joint project in 1984. And they kept tinkering with it. Some testing and evaluation said, you know, parts commonality with the A2 rifle. We want as much of that as we can get away with. Early on, you might have a straight wall barrel. 3-round burst seems to have stuck. Of course, standard lower receiver, standard mags, all that good stuff. In 1985, the Picatinny Arsenal was tasked with creating 40 prototypes, test concept models, early XM4, pre-M4 type guns. And yeah, they get to work on that. So this is where Picatinny definitely is involved. However, just the next year, in 1986, the Army would withdraw funding. This era in arms spending, especially small arms, is difficult. But what's important here is the U.S. Marine Corps is going it alone, and development does continue. And by 1987, they say, look, we've finalized the design. Now, it's not identical to this. At this point, it still has a fixed carry handle. But they've done things like they're developing the new double heat shield ovular handguards. The barrel oscillates a little bit between the stepped profile for the 203 grenade launcher and kind of a straight wall, thin profile heavy, but this obviously would be the deal. The so-called M4 cuts, the feed ramp would appear, actually meaning this is no longer, strictly speaking, an M16A2 upper receiver, because it had to be different. They would also tinker around with new types of buffer. Eventually, this would result in what we know today as the H buffer, the heavy buffer. Interestingly, it still uses the carbine length system all the way back to the 1960s, and the carbine length tube receiver extension, and it would still be 2-position with the Fiberlight at this point, although it would have the A2 pistol grip, forward assist, brass deflector, single-sided, safe, single burst mode, standard half by 28 threads, and Standard A2 flash adder / recoil compensator. So in 87, the Army is not that interested, but the design is considered ready to go, and the Marine Corps, who's still involved, does purchase a small quantity for things like MARSOC and Scout type divisions, that kind of thing. Special Forces. In fact, this was always meant for Special Forces. How many at this time? Well under 1,000, 900 in late 80s. Is it still known as the XM4? It's kind of a bone of contention. We don't really know. In some ways, it should have been officially adopted, but then it seems like it still kept the X designation. Here's the deal. This was a relatively low priority thing, like I said. This was not meant to be a large order. This was meant to be a carbine. The M16A2 was just going into service. In fact, it wouldn't actually see combat until December of 1989 with the invasion of Panama. This was just meant for support troops. So they figured, yeah, we'll buy a few tens of thousands here where we need them. It's definitely lighter, shorter than the M16A2. About 33 inches with the stock out. Yeah, about 7.5 pounds with the mag in it, empty, sling and all that. Getting closer to 6.5 pounds, just bare bones. That's why there was actually a lawsuit. Not Colt doing the suing, but being sued in 1988. FN USA sued Colt, the U.S. government, because of how things were going on. FN at this point has the M16A2 contract. Colt, this is their own thing with the U.S. Army and things. Basically, Colt ends up with a sole source contract. Part of it is because of leaked TDP info. Part of it is it just wasn't that big of a deal. What have you, they mollified FN, go on. So Colt is going to supply all the M4s to the U.S. Armed Forces, which at this time is really only the Marines, although the Army still has open orders. They passed their trials and testing for what it is. What about the name? The M4, XM4 as it began. No one even really knows for sure. I've often heard it said that, okay, M1 carbine, and then you have the M3 grease gun. Thing is, those are two separate M's. The M1 carbine is a carbine, a rifle, short rifle. The M3 grease gun is a submachine gun. There is already an M1 submachine gun, the Thompson, in M4A1. There's also a M3 carbine, which was the night fighting version based on the M1 and, of course, the select fire M2 carbine. I think in reality, that's the family. This goes from M1, M2, M3 carbine, which are all of a family. This being the M4 carbine, which is totally different. However, the M2 and the M3 were long out of active U.S. service. So the M3 grease gun, which was still in service in the late 80s, usually with tank crews and the like, is logical. It's one of those things where it wasn't intended, but it actually makes sense. So we'll go with it. Either way, replacement for the few remaining M1 carbines and some M3 goose guns, maybe some pistols and random other submachine guns in service, support troops, that kind of dealio. Things start to shift in this gun's favor after the 1991 Gulf War. The Army troops in the desert issued with the M16A2. Some still have the old M16A1 for that matter. Some, in certain areas and situations, say that it is too long and too heavy, and they would much prefer a carbine. That already kind of puts a bug in the Army's ears. Now keep in mind, Special Forces, SOCOM, Delta, they've been buying off-the-shelf various versions like the Colt Model 723 for limited use, a few dozen, a few hundred here and there. So they're in Special Forces, word gets around. Really, the tipping point is 1993 Mogadishu. In that battle, you had Rangers with the M16A2, you had Delta with their so-called Black Hawk Down carbines. One of them liked their guns a lot more than the other. All of these events kind of coalesced. The summer of 1993, finally the Army places its first major, important, big contract for the new Colt M4 carbine. Essentially a decade after development began. So in 1994, it would be type classified as Carbine 5.56 M4. In 1995, the first guns would be delivered. And remember how we said in 1987 the design was complete? Well, at the last minute, some more updates and changes kind of crept in. This is when we went from the 2 position in to the 4 position extension. This was actually a field expedient modification made by some SOCOM units in the early 90s to their existing Colt guns, and it was made a standard production thing right as the M4 was coming into service. By the way, this was the Colt Model 920. But the biggest one is here. The receiver. The M4 Carbine was probably the first production model gun to have a mil-spec 1913 rail. Although in the beginning, it just came with a iron sight carry handle bolted onto the pick rail receiver. And by pick rail, yes, I know that irks certain people out there. Picatinny Arsenal was involved in the sense that they requested and supported and tested this development of the rail. According to Chris, the company ARMS was the one that primarily developed this. This rail system is basically a standardized version of Weaver for U.S. Armed Forces, and it worked because it has been the standard for 30 years now. But yeah, it's basically a standardized Weaver. In the beginning, they didn't really utilize it on these guns. Did some early M4s have it, have the fixed carry handle? It doesn't really seem like the full production version that went to the Army by 95 did. However, we have those handful of guns that went to the Marines. But I would still kind of prefer to think of those as the XM4. We can debate. It doesn't really matter. But even if that was something kind of more stuck on for the future, as it were. The ovular double heat shield handguards were here. The reversible side sling mount was here, pinned on so you can easily flip it around. By this point, they've standardized on the government profile, so you have a heavy profile A2 style out here with the step down for the 203. And then just like with the A2 rifle, it's thinner under the handguard. Does that make any sense? Is that logical? No, it is not, but oh well. At this time, though, we still have the Fiberlight Car 15 appearing stock. In the very beginning, our bolt group is essentially identical to an M16A2, although soon they would go to an extra power extractor, spring, and a few other little tweaks to improve things. I should also mention that it's the M4 that is safe, single, burst. And technically, any gun that has the Colt Model 921 configured selector with safe, single, auto is an M4A1, technically. In the beginning, these were only really earmarked for special forces, vehicle drivers, crews of certain other things, headquarters, sometimes fire team leaders, platoon leaders, that kind of thing. Just someone that needs something light and handy to use, especially if they're in a command position. Something maybe replacing a pistol or a submachine gun. You need something a little more because it is firing the standard 7.62 NATO cartridge. Thanks to the 1-in-7 twist with the new 62 grain projectile, you are getting better performance out of this 14.5-inch barrel than you would have with the older 1-in-12 55 grain, which did much better out of a 20-incher, give or take. So it was meant to be a defensive gun, a PDW, and in that role, it was good. However, the so-called War on Terror would change things. This was only going into service in 1999 with Kosovo, and the very first standard infantry just started to get it in 2000 in the Army. when everything changed after 9/11. Try to emulate 3-round burst. Over the period of about 2002 to 2005 in the Army, and it was really just by necessity and request. There wasn't a huge push to do it. They were, at least the higher-ups were happy with their M16A2s, but effectively the M16A2 was slowly but surely phased out of frontline forward service for the original M4 Carbine here, meaning it was being used by more and more people in a desert and or mountainous environment, much higher round counts than originally called upon, often using older, worn-out alloy mags too. This is kind of pre-Magpul generation, and that's why I really like this gun. This is representative of a first-generation style M4 handguards, carry handle. I should mention the classic M4 stock, which was developed at Picatinny, appears around 2000 or so. Fits right on the same tube, same four position. They would also go away from the original nut with just the hole in it to the castle nut. And not only is this gun representative of the original M4, in all reality, the original M4A1 looked the exact same, just with a different selector setup and magwell marking. But it would rather quickly evolve into this, especially the Knight's Armament DIAC features. And I have this one set up here. This is a Colt 6920 US SOCOM. Modified it some. It's, you know, circa 2010, 2012 time frame with the Phoenix. Well, the M4A1 started off in the Colt catalog as the model 921, and it was simply a full auto capable instead of burst mode capable M4. This was the model 920. Both had the same government profile, in other words, goofy under the handguard barrel. Car 15, later M4 stock, all that good stuff supplied with standard alloy mags. Yeah, it appeared in 1991, give or take, and it was ordered for SOCOM and other special forces just after the M4 started seeing contract orders. The first contracts, like I said, were late 93 for the M4. The A1 started to be delivered in early 94 and started to get accepted after testing in May of 94. And of course, SOCOM can just do off-the-shelf purchases. That's why even though the burst mode version was what was adopted, we're still kind of under that sole source thing with Colt, and they're just expecting to have a few thousand. Remember, and by 95, Special Forces start deploying these and start using them in Kosovo alongside the standard M4 and regular units. And very quickly, they have issues. Rather than using this as a second line weapon, a PDW, just for defense, SOCOM, being the role they're in, well, they're using them for front line offensive operations. You've got and the overheating issue really becomes apparent after the war on terror kicks off. Now, they look the same out here. The difference is, again, they beef up the barrel under our handguard here. This was originally kind of experimented with, worked on at Crane Naval Warfare Center around 2000, 2001, working with Colt, and the earliest so-called 921 HBs would soon come out of the factory, and by 2004, the heavy barrel version of the M4A1 was the standard that SOCOM Special Forces types were using. So that's an important update. What about the rest of the gobbledygook on this gun? Well, the Knight's Armament Riz, later Raz, was a pretty early thing. The SOPMOD kit was a concept with its roots in the very late 80s, early 90s to issue basically just the kitchen sink to an operator. It'll be kept in a case and they can pick what accessories they need. And it would evolve over time. The Block 1 SOPMOD kit had lights, early versions of lasers, different optics, the 203 grenade launcher, and to attach them, as early as 1997, 1998, the Knight's Armament Riz M5 here forearm was in the kit. And it was actually easy for them to use because of it just bolted on directly, no tools required. Had these covers if you didn't need to use it for accessories, and it came with the, honestly, I like it, the broom handle grip. It's so iconic. With the broom handle. Definitely not as comfy. Certainly better than nothing. It's also a two-piece in a cool way because of that grenade launcher. It's easy to pop off your bottom. And then you could put your launcher on. And here we can see the heavy profile throughout the crane. And notice the cuts here under the wrench flats there. Most of your SOCOM profile civilian barrels don't have those, and those correspond with the cut up here for the 203. So that's where they beef it up. It does have a heat shield. And today, this is very antiquated technology, even though some of the Knight's Armament handguards are still in service. But back then, it added a lot of flexibility. It was an early 1913 rail component. They did not add more than a few ounces weight. As for the removal of the carry handle, it wouldn't take long, and they would need a backup iron sight just in case. The earliest ones in the SOPMOD kits were from Knight's Armament, CAC. They would also have some ARMS brand ones and some LMT brand ones over time. But developed at Picatinny, the Maytec or Mautic rear sight became the de facto standard. You can argue how good or bad it is, but it's a standard. As for the so-called SOPMOD buttstock, this is primarily developed by LMT working with Crane again. And, well, it's superior. Better cheek weld, storage compartment for batteries, rubber butt plate, QD sling sockets. Now this one's a B5, who eventually got the government contract in addition to LMT. And around 2010, you started to see these get supplied as the military would need more. Originally, this started off as a spec ops type stock. You saw them with SEALs, Rangers, Delta. Eventually, the Marines would get some too, and the Raiders. As far as the four-prong hider here, this is a Surefire SF4P. This style came in the late 2000s, 2010, in that time period. There would also be the three-prong version. This one's kind of unique for this version. And this would be the earliest use of sound suppressors. Started off very low-key, and they seemed to always kind of prefer Surefire. In 2012, Surefire got a pretty big suppressor contract. But this was good because it allowed the suppressor to go on and off easily. It was repeatable. It returned to its point, no issues. And this is a much more effective flash hider than the original M16A2 style here. So that was the SOPMOD Block 1. It kind of phased in until about 2002, 2003, when you start to see the phase 1, the Block 1 phase replacements. They start to integrate more and more technology. And then you'll eventually get to Block 2, which its big feature is the Daniel Defense free-floated rail system with the low-profile gas block. And many other technologies. But the reason I set my rifle up like this is because, for the most part, not only did this configuration go to SOCOM, Special Forces, but it would eventually make its way to the Army, Standard Frontline Forces, Marines, and even some in the Air Force, what have you, although much smaller numbers. Because things would start spreading as operations would pick up in Afghanistan and as the war would begin in 2003 in Iraq. The M4, by the way, has a bayonet lug, standard, and an M7 will fit, but by this point the M9 is the normal pokey stabby thing. M9 is still in the service today. Heck, the M7 is still in service today. So it definitely could take a bayonet. Just as SOCOM had overheating issues, as this started to phase into the regular Army, by 2005 they had their own issues. In fact, there were a couple of very famous incidences around 2007, 2008 with overheating. With some Arms Corps 55 grain I still have. Now, the SOCOM barrel, as it was known, would give more time before cook-off would happen, about 15 or 20% gain in firepower. But of course, this is also still a burst fire gun, not full auto like the M4A1, and they're still being ordered, the M4s. By 2005, the Army has pretty much retired all their M16A2s. They have M4s in the field. The Marines, interestingly, they would end up ordering a good number of the original burst fire M4. And in 2007, an order went down that higher-ranking officers and some fire team leaders, whatever, drivers, would turn in their M9 Berettas in favor of M4 carbines. And the Marines would actually be quite a long-lived user of the M4, although ironically they were the only real big user of the M16A4, the rifle version. Try the Phoenix ammo in the A4, which I'm sure you know about with the 1913 rail, otherwise pretty much the same as the A2. And so that was their standard infantry gun. Although in 2010, they made the HK 416 their new light machine gun, squad automatic weapon, support weapon, as the M27 IAR. So basically you had the HK IAR as your support gun, you had the M16A4 as your rifle in the Marines, and they did issue the carbine, kind of more of its intended role as a carbine for leadership billets and that kind of thing. Of course, MARSOC would get some as well. Makes perfect sense, I would say. What about the Air Force? Well, their path is even more interesting because you have the GAL-5s and then you have the GUU-5, the GU-5Ps. The Air Force has a whole mutt of guns. In fact, right as the M4 is going into service in 94, 95, the Air Force purchases either new barrels or new uppers for their GU-5Ps, and they rebarrel them. And so some of the later style GU-5Ps will have the 203 cut 14.5-inch barrel. Even some can have their movable carry handle, although early on they were still fixed. And they'll even have either the Fiberlight or eventually M4 stock, but these are not true M4s as such, not yet. They were just reworking their old Goof IPs for base guard duties and their own special forces. But at the end of 2002, the U.S. Air Force started getting brand new M4s, again from Colt, because we're still under that sole source contract. And by 2006, they're retiring the old Goof IPs and going to the M4 where applicable. Of course, there's still a lot of older guns knocking about as well. As for the Navy, they don't need a ton of M4s. They get a few here and there, but their use of them is pretty low-key. Just doesn't really quite fit what they do outside of the Navy SEALs and other special forces like the boat service. But a lot of those guys would actually go for the M4A1. Anywho, the Coast Guard, smallest user of all. The Coast Guard uses a lot of pistols based on their duties, their roles. So they only ever picked up a handful, 4, 5, 6,000 M4s in this decade. I'll say this, it's stinkier than the Phoenix. But it works. And that's kind of how things continue through 2008. But then, July 1st, 2009, there's a major change. The U.S. Army gains full rights, full control, full ownership over the M4 Carbine design, M4A1 as well, of course. And Colt effectively loses its sole source contract. Now, the M4, M4A1, which has become the de facto standard for most of the branches, it's open for bids, contracts. Colt no longer has a monopoly on it. And the last Colts seem to have been delivered in 2010. Some sources say 2011 under the old sole source. But at this point, yeah, they're thinking towards the future. And they have the PIP program, the PIP program, the Product Improvement Program. They're starting to see the wisdom of the traditional M16A1 fire control group, finally. Now, a lot of things were examined during the PIP, but really the only thing that hung on to become a standard is the ambidextrous safety selector here. Also, the SOPMOD stock would start to see much wider issuance throughout the Army. The CAC forearm became a de facto standard. By this point, either they're not shipping with carry handles at all, or they're pretty much just being tossed aside. The MOTEC sight, various other kind of sights, depending on who, what, when, and where, are the standard. And while the QD prong flash hider from Surefire is more common after 2012, I would say that's the one thing on this that's not quite a standard gun. But of course, the big deal is the so-called SOCOM barrel and the switch over from the M4 fire control group to the M4A1. Usually those two went hand in hand, but not always. The U.S. Army would order over 300,000 new barrel assemblies, which would also include the bolt to rebarrel to the heavy. They would also order over 300,000 A1 fire control groups. Most would be converted together, although there would be some A1s left with the government profile barrel for weight reasons, and sure, why not? This gave just better ability in a firefight, especially with the heavy barrel, to put more lead down range, more controllability. It's often pointed out too that the trigger on the auto versus the burst is much more consistent and predictable, which makes sense. It's also just a simpler gun, less parts to go wonky and wrong, especially in a desert. So Yeah, the burst mode thing was very much 80s. That was just something you saw many militaries going to. But when the real world came a knocking, yeah, back to the simple, dependable, automatic, and just good training. And of course, we'd also go from the original M855 round to the M855A1 round, and that would help too. Again, I don't have this one all kitted out with all the accessories. You can see all kinds of things. The PMags first started to see some use. People just buy them, Generation 1, and take them over to Afghanistan, Iraq. This is 2004, 2005 timeframe. The Army and the Marines started to kind of test them a little bit around 2010. By this point, we're getting to more advanced PMags. They get serious about it around 2012 and essentially approve them in both branches for private purchase and private use. And then in 2016, they do the big test in the Army. They put the Generation 3 PMag up against the current alloy mag with the tan follower, the ones that are kind of FDE painted. And in every way, the PMag was said to have won handily. So in 2017, the Army officially adopted, gave it an NSN, the PMag, and the Marines would soon follow suit. How did we get to where we're at today? Again, the M16A2 was supposed to be the standard frontline gun, but it barely lasted past Gulf 1, and already by Kosovo, the M4, which was meant to be just the backup gun, was the de facto standard, not just special forces, but where everyone. Those special forces were going for the A1 variant. And this process within the Army would take place going from the M16A2 to the M4 about 2005, 2006. The Marines would be a little bit later in coming, Air Force about the same time, Navy when they needed to. Either way, by the time the Army got full rights to the M4 in 2009, it was the standard, and Colt had delivered hundreds of thousands by this point, basically 400,000. Of those, they would soon purchase bits and bobs to convert about 300,000 to the M4A1 standard. This process would begin, and by 2015, 2016, they had converted nearly all of them, about 250,000, and a few years later, they hit their 300,000 mark. However, the Army has nearly 500,000 carbines in inventory. What about the other ones? You know, some just wear out. They need other ones. Of course, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines often just draw from Army orders, depending on procurement. And these contracts are IDICs, not to be confused with IDIC from Star Trek, but IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. Basically, kind of posting minimum guaranteed initial orders and then maximum orders and for a time period. Well, competitive bidding begins, and to pretty much everyone's surprise, in April of 2012, it's announced that Remington wins the contract to produce new TDP M4, M4A1s for the Army and others. They have an initial order of 24,000 to last a year, 2,000 per month are to be delivered, and the contract could go up to 120,000 over roughly a 5-year period. And Remington starts to tool up, getting ready to go, and Colt takes him to court. Yeah, Colt in court again. This would be soon resolved in early 2013, but not in Colt's favor or Remington's. Instead, in February, FN Herstal, FN America, FN USA, actually gets the contract for 120,000 for 5 years instead, becoming the provider of the M4, M4A1. Colt lost out because they're kind of a whiny bitch, and Remington lost out because they were having some weird manufacturing. It's Remington, okay? It's Freedom Group Remington. Do I need to say more? This is where FN, who had been the provider of the M16A2, steps in and begins providing M4s, or at this point, new production M4A1s. So the Army's converting theirs. They're also purchasing new ones as needed. The Air Force is not doing the conversion thing. They're purchasing new as needed, as is the Navy. Interesting with the Marines. In 2015, it's bandied about that they should retire the M16A4 and replace it with the M4A1. The Marines are still holding on to their burst fire guns for the most part. They didn't convert very many to the A1, and they haven't purchased all that many. And in late 2015, it's approved. In fact, a timeline set up within a year, so roughly September of 2016, M16A4s are out, M4 or M4A1s, depending on what's needed, are in. That's going to be the frontline gun. And the M27 will be the support weapon. That seems to be the plan. They're going to buy from FN. At the end of 2017, the Marines reverse things and say, actually, for all frontline forward combat units, we're going to give them the M27 IAR. And they place an order for 15,000 with Heckler and Koch. And that order would be successfully delivered. Because in 2018, they actually began ordering new production M4A1s from FN to equip leadership roles. And MARSOC actually hangs on to the M4A1 because it's lighter, more handy than the M27. The M27 has a 16.5-inch barrel and is just a chunkier monkey. So we actually start to see quite a number of new production FN M4A1s going into the Marines in a support role. So we have the M27 and the M4A1. The same year, the Air Force begins a big program and project to get rid of older guns and retire their M4s. And between that time and 2022, they purchase new M4A1s from FN. The Navy, who has the smallest number, they get what they need. They, too, don't do a lot of conversions. They purchase new. Either way, by this point, the Army has roughly 480,000 M4A1 carbines in service, with very few M4s left. The Air Force and the Marines have 40,000 A1s, with a couple of thousand maybe old M4s knocking about, but not a very large number. And the U.S. Navy is the smaller user with roughly 30,000 M4A1s, virtually no M4s left. We're talking, 2019, 2020 today. The Coast Guard would remain the only major user, and I say that in quotes, of the M4 over the A1, only because they kept 4, 5, 6,000 M4 guns around, and they only ever acquired 2, maybe 2,500 M4A1s. It just really wasn't what they needed. They were different role. So that was the disposition as FN's contract would roll through. And FN would end up producing quite a large number over that time, and Colt's kind of left out in the cold. That is until November of 2018, when a foreign military sales contract comes down that's to be split evenly between FN and Colt. It's around 60,000 pieces total, so 30,000 each manufacturer. This really throws Colt a lifeline, and that's actually why this gun was made. The uppers on these SOCOMs are essentially leftover 2018 foreign military sales, foreign military aid contracts. And some of these would go to American forces if and when needed, because, the wars. But Iraq is winding down, so it's just there. In 2019, Colt would get another contract themselves. It was smaller. It was a foreign military contract directly. And FN would complete their half and get another IDIQ, an IDIQ contract for 5 years, worth up to 120,000 guns, give or take, beginning in 2020, which actually is probably still in effect right now as we get into the middle of 2025. It might have been wrapped up by now. It's right at the end of that contract, so FN's in. Which actually gets us to an interesting point. This spring, there's been talk about yet another 5-year contract for up to 30,000 pieces, although the initial order guarantees only for 90 guns. And this is, as far as I know, supposed to go to Colt, but things could happen at the last minute to switch it around, which means Colt might be throwing another lifeline to make yet more M4A1s over something else. Most of these are probably going to go to foreign customers, but also National Guard, reserve units, just, replenishing national stocks, as many of them were given or sold or whatever to Ukraine in recent years. Just, there. It's not a huge contract, not a huge order, but it exists. What about the XM7? That was supposed to be replacing the M4A1, right, in 2022? Yeah, what about that? To date, there are not any in frontline service. It's still an XM, not an M. This is still the standard gun. Now, that could change tomorrow, but right now, there are just maybe a couple of thousand XM7s knocking about with the 101, some of the National Guard units. They're still in the trials evaluation phase. Do I think they're going to go much? No, I really don't, but that's neither here nor there. Could be very wrong. The point is, they have plenty of new M4A1s, be they FN or Colt. So I'd be really interested to see. Now in the Marines with the M27, that was successful. They did get theirs, and they are fielding them with M4s and support roles, which makes perfect sense because the M4 is much cheaper. As far as the Air Force and the Navy, oh heck yeah, they're using M4A1s. No plans to change. They're not interested in the M7. Speaking of cost, one more thing to kind of touch upon. Even though the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force didn't upgrade their M4s, for one thing, they had far fewer of them than the Army. Doesn't mean it wasn't a wise idea. Why did the Army do that? Well, it's pretty clear. Cost. Why not? New production M4, M4A1s were $600 to $800 government contract. Yeah, you think the government get a bigger discount? Nah, not really. Of course, part of that is support equipment and all that too. But either way, new ones, that much. Converting one, the parts, the labor, they're having their own guys do them. You're looking at roughly $300 a rifle, give or take. So, let's say half the cost. If the conversion involved the heavy barrel, if it didn't have to do it, was the buffer. The 14.5-inch government profile barrel had the H buffer. When they went to the 14.5-inch SOCOM barrel, the heavy, they went to the H2 buffer because you have a different balancing mass and point, and that was to basically prevent bolt bounce and to better work with the full auto versus burst fire. So, small difference going to the H2 buffer. There are, of course, H3s out there, which can sometimes be found on overly worn guns, or the Mark 18 sometimes has an H3, especially with the suppressor. That's outside of the scope of this video. If it works, it works. And that's why today the projections are this is still going to be in U.S. military service, even more or less frontline, till at least 2040. It's modular. It's upgradable. That's why they were able to be so flexible going from the M16A2 to the M4 to the M4A1 and beyond, like the Mark 12 and all the SOPMOD adaptations. Yes, in the beginning, they had issues. But they had issues because of how they were being deployed in ways they weren't meant to be used. Both of these are very reliable, very business-type guns. And I really like getting them out to the range. And I think the M4 will be around for a very long time in service. And I think it has matured, and we see that. Are there newer, better gun designs today? Yes, absolutely. And if we were starting off from scratch or, had a gun made back in the 70s like a lot of our allies, that makes sense. And if we still had the original M4, that would make sense too. this gun is not a great frontline infantry weapon, although it has very good special applications. But over time and testing, it really has matured. And I can't even count the number of times the U.S. Army, mostly the Army, Department of Defense, has had trials to replace this, going back to like the G11 in the 80s, the ACR, the SCAR program. That was supposed to be the next greatest thing. And then, of course, you had the IC program. I think the XM7, all that, is mostly going to be that, too. I think there will be some elements that come out of the XM7 program that are useful. Maybe finally a good new DMR, which we really do need. I would say a new optic, but it seems like the XM157 isn't doing that great. In fact, looking at what troops are saying, they have more criticism for that optic than they do the 6.8 round or the XM7 rifle itself. So, yeah, who knows? Either way, this is the standard, and not just because we have so many. I mean, a lot have been given away or sold to foreign allies. Nevertheless, the U.S. military has about 550,000 in inventory. The bulk of them, about 400,000, are Colts, about 150,000, give or take, are FNs. Quality is identical to both, if not even a little better with FN. It's going to take a big reason to do it. And again, the other branches besides the Army aren't even interested in the XM7. Not only have the guns, you have the magazines for them, the ammunition. In the case of the XM7, you have all that around. You have unit armors, you have supply chains with all the parts and doodads and whatnots and widgets set up for them. You have half a century of know-how and experience on how to keep these guns running, not to mention 2 decades of real combat field experience, which is, why we have the modern updated M4A1 today. This one I have is just kind of a collectible of the era I grew up in. This was the thing in the 90s, the current Colt, as it were. And this one is just right in the middle of Iraq, Afghanistan. And it's cool that Colt produced this version for the civilian market. It's about as close to a military replica as they're ever likely to do, because Colt is Colt. They do make me happy. And I do enjoy the history and the development and just why the things are the way they are on these. Open it up to you in the comments. Again, I did this video because we've done AK videos, and it's been a minute since we've done an AR video, and it just felt like time, and I felt like shooting these. But let me know what you think in the comments. And again, I'm just rambling on the swings, so I'm sure I got some things wrong. And of course, I could sit here talking for 12 hours and not cover even a tenth of everything out here. So it's just, what kind of came to mind and what I felt like hanging out and talking about. If you'd like to help support us, and sometimes I will put extended or early release versions of these videos with bloopers and stuff over on Patreon. Check that out. And of course, if you do prefer the AK videos, we'll have more of those coming soon. Put out a lot of FAL videos recently too. But I just kind of felt like going here today. With that, this is Misha, and I'm going to go inside and see what I can whip up for dinner. Catch you very soon next time.